88% of American adults have some degree of insulin resistance. High blood pressure is an early sign of insulin resistance. Fat gain, obviously, difficulty losing weight, brain fog or fatigue, frequent carb and sugar cravings, sometimes elevated triglycerides. All of those are going to be those really, really early signs. And I was like, where's your diabetes medications? Because you have amputations, you have a history of diabetes, you're not taking any medications. Oh my gosh, let me check your blood sugar because it's probably raging high. And he's like, I don't need them anymore. I got off of them. I was like, oh. And he's like, well, I just changed my diet finally. I stopped eating a bunch of garbage and I started eating low carb and I reversed my diabetes. And I was like, good for you. What motivated you to do that? And he's like, I didn't want him to take my other foot because then I couldn't live independently anymore. You're never too, quote unquote, far gone. It's never too late. You can always change. And for the love of Pete, if you don't want to do it for yourself, do it for your loved ones. Because there are people who care about you. There are people who worry about you and they want the best for you. So want the best for yourself.
Morgan, when somebody's on the insulin resistance continuum, which can last up to 20 years before they develop full-blown type 2 diabetes, what are the symptoms they're going to notice when things are happening in a negative way inside the body?
Of course. So I think one thing would be high blood pressure. Often that's one of the earliest signs of insulin resistance. If you're tracing somebody's medication chart, sometimes that blood pressure medication or a combination is the earliest prescribed. So high blood pressure is an early sign of insulin resistance. Fat gain, obviously, is an early sign of insulin resistance. Difficulty losing weight, brain fog or fatigue, frequent carb and sugar cravings. All of those are going to be those really, really early signs. Sometimes elevated triglycerides can also be a sign. But then, like you said, that's all going on in the background for 10 to 20 years, even before we're going to start to see a rise in your blood glucose or your hemoglobin A1C, which is that classic indicator of insulin resistance.
And just to give people a general idea, what are the latest stats showing the number of people right now affected by this?
Oh, it's staggering. Last I checked was 88% of American adults have some degree of insulin resistance. They may not have full-blown prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, but even those stats are pretty staggering. So about 3 out of every 4 adults age 65 and older, so about 75%, has either prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, so full-blown insulin resistance. But unfortunately, many of them don't know. We can get into why that is and why physicians are ignoring pre-diabetic blood sugar levels. But that's really staggering because diabetes is expensive. It shortens your life. It reduces your quality of life. It comes with a host of other sequelae also caused by insulin resistance. So this is a really important topic to tackle as early in life as possible.
Well, let's go zoom in really micro here. We've talked about a lot of the symptoms that people experience outwardly, but as this is developing in the body over years, what is happening at a cellular level?
Sure. So there's a lot of different theories on where insulin resistance really starts. I love Dr. Ben Bickman. I think both of his books are excellent. And he's a metabolic researcher and he studies fat cells. And his belief, as is mine, is that insulin resistance starts in the fat cell. And I think in order to best describe this, I wanted to give a little bit of background on fat. So our body wants to store fat in subcutaneous stores. And that means just under the skin. So it's the stuff that you can like pinch and grab. If you're leaning forward and you grab your belly fat, that's all subcutaneous fat. That's one store. That's where your body wants to store it. Another store is visceral fat, and that's going to be beneath the abdominal muscle layer, kind of surrounding those internal organs. Okay, that's the visceral fat. And then another type of fat is called ectopic fat. This is just fat that's stored plainly where it's not supposed to be stored. So it could be stored in the muscles, it could be stored in the pancreas, it could be stored in the liver, just really anywhere it's not supposed to be. So when I'm talking about insulin resistance starting in the fat cells, I'm talking about subcutaneous fat. That's where your body, again, it's that preferred storage site for excess nutrients in general. And So as we're developing, as we're growing, we are growing our fat stores because we're growing our number of fat cells. And that kind of taps out at like early adulthood, late adolescence or early adulthood. We don't really develop more fat cells, but instead there's this transition to filling what fat cells we have, like fuller, essentially. So as we age, as we get to about age 60, this becomes important. Then we start to lose fat cells, okay, which might sound like a good thing, but it's actually not from an insulin resistance standpoint. So let's go ahead and back it up because everybody has something called their personal fat threshold, which is how much fat you can safely store in your subcutaneous supplies in small fat cells. So fat cells that are small essentially have greater insulin sensitivity. There's more insulin receptors like on the surface compared to a large fat cell. So we want small fat cells, not large fat cells. But the problem is that as we age, if we continue to eat in excess and need to store body fat, those subcutaneous fat cells, they all fill up. So then they have to get bigger and bigger. And when they get bigger, a couple things happen. First is they move farther away from a blood vessel, so they're getting less nutrients. They can start to leak fat in the bloodstream. That's, for example, one cause of like high triglycerides, high blood fat. Your fat cells are actually leaking fat into the blood. But then they also start to release inflammatory substances into the blood and increase inflammation. So as this is happening, as your subcutaneous fat cells are getting larger and larger and leaking things into the blood, well, what happens there? Like that stuff has to go somewhere, and it goes downstream to your liver, to your visceral area, to your muscles, and then you're going to start to get excess glucose in those areas. So let me describe the insulin resistant state too in those fat cells. Big fat cells become insulin resistant because insulin essentially allows fat to be stored, and they don't want any more. It's like after a big Thanksgiving dinner, you've had 2 plates of food, you're absolutely stuffed. You're like, please do not feed me one more piece of pie. That's what your large fat cells are saying when they're insulin resistant. It's saying, I cannot take in any more food because I have enough. And so that's what happens. They start to leak. Things go downstream. And so that's kind of why I think it starts in those subcutaneous fat cells. And then things travel downstream to your muscles, to your liver, to your visceral stores. Does that make sense? Hopefully I'm explaining that clearly enough.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is once these subcutaneous fat cells become enlarged, they start leaking. Then the fat starts moving around the body to different areas and building up in areas we don't want it.
Yep. And then those, also become insulin resistant there. So unfortunately, insulin resistance, it leaves no cell, unaffected. It can affect every cell in your body. And that's why there are so many sequelae of it. You just can't escape it, like joint pain, of course, diabetes, certain types of dementia, cancer, kidney disease, high blood pressure, sarcopenia in your muscles. So I think it really does start with controlling that subcutaneous fat and monitoring how much we're eating and what we're eating. Because here's another thing I didn't mention. We want small fat cells, right? Well, the number one dietary fat that Americans eat is a fat called linoleic acid, which is found in some polyunsaturated fatty oils like canola oil and soybean oil, things that your chicken fingers are fried in and that your French fries are fried in. And so when we're having a diet that's really high in linoleic acid, that's promoting fat cell growth. So your fat cells are getting larger, you're not like filling up more of them, essentially. So that's one reason I believe that we're starting to see insulin resistance earlier and earlier, is just the quality of diet that's high in processed and fried foods, high in linoleic acid, that's promoting insulin resistance in the fat cells much earlier in life. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think you mentioned that as we age, we have fewer fat cells.
Yeah. So
So, what that leads me to believe is because there's less storage area, it's going to be easier for the cells that we still have to fill up and overflow and then cause the issues you talked about.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So I get a big question all the time, like, does insulin resistance naturally rise with age? And in a way it does, but also in a way, some of it can be mitigated through lifestyle changes. So the first thing that naturally does happen is after about age 60, you start to lose fat cells. And so let's say you had 10 fat cells that had a certain amount of fat, and now you just have 7 fat cells, but the same amount of fat. So the 7 fat cells are going to be larger in size, more likely to leak fatty acids and inflammatory substances into the bloodstream and go downstream to cause problems elsewhere in your body. But another issue is just lack of movement and lack of mobility in general, a decline in muscle mass. So you do have natural hormone declines in human growth hormone and testosterone, two really important muscles to maintain muscle, or hormones to maintain muscle mass as we age. And so with that decline, we need to be very vigilant about resistance training and adequate protein intake so that we can slow that muscle loss, because muscle is a very big reservoir for your glucose to go after you eat it. So the more muscle mass you have, the more insulin sensitive you're going to be. That's why athletes can get away with eating so many carbohydrates, is because they have a lot of muscle mass. And then the third thing, so aside from, you know, dying fat cells, making your existing fat cells larger, you have a decline in muscle mass from a natural decline in hormones, but also as we age, a lot of adults just aren't as physically active. And then third, for women going through menopause. So when a woman goes through menopause, around like age 51 is the average age, she's going to start to notice a significant change in her body composition. She's going to say, man, I'm not eating any differently. I'm not exercising any differently, but all of a sudden I feel really soft. I feel larger around the midsection. I'm getting a lot more belly fat. My body fat is redistributing to the central region. What the heck is happening to me? And your ovaries during menopause, they kind of shut down. They're like, you guys, I've done my job for 50 years. I'm tapped out. I'm done. Peace out. Like, have a nice, good luck. Good luck the rest of the body. And so estrogen is not just a reproductive hormone, right? It's important for your hair and your brain and your skin and your bones. And so your body still does need estrogen, but other areas are going to pick up the slack of the ovaries. And two that are really important would be your adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys, but then also your adipose, or your fat tissue, starts to produce more of the estrogen. And so automatically after menopause, your fat tissue becomes more valuable real estate to your body because it's producing estrogen that's no longer being made by your ovaries. And then secondly, midlife can be a very stressful season for women for a lot of reasons. Maybe they're at the height of their career, or maybe like transitioning into retirement. So they're kind of forced with that identity change. They might have children leaving the house, going off to college. Maybe they have grandbabies that they get to take care of, or aging parents can be a huge stress on women. So if women aren't very vigilant during this season of midlife to control stress and get adequate sleep, that's going to essentially tax those adrenal glands even more, producing stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, and then there's less capacity to produce estrogen. So guess what? Your fat tissue becomes even more valuable real estate if you're stressed out and you're postmenopausal. So those would be the three primary things that would contribute to insulin resistance increasing as somebody ages.
All right, let's take things a bit more upstream and talk about early insulin resistance. What is causing that? And what I'm getting at there is sugar, carbohydrates in the diet, spiking blood glucose, insulin initially being able to deal with that and shove it into cells. And then over time, if we continue to eat that way, what happens with insulin, which is going to lead to everything you just talked about?
Well, one factor that you mentioned, a diet high in refined carbohydrates and sugar. So think about bagels English muffin, cereals, even healthy, quote unquote, healthy carbohydrates like oatmeal and fruit. A lot of those are going to spike your blood sugar. And insulin's primary job is to keep your blood sugars in a healthy range. So after you eat a meal that's high in carbohydrates, spikes your blood sugar, insulin is released to move that sugar into your cells to either be used for energy or stored for later use. So a diet high in, like anything that essentially raises your blood sugar or raises your insulin levels is going to be a causative factor for insulin resistance. So a diet high in carbs, but again, a diet high in refined seed oils that are high in linoleic acid that's going to promote growth of fat cells instead of filling up more smaller fat cells. That's going to contribute to insulin resistance as well. Stress, unfortunately, and sleep deprivation, those because sleep deprivation is a form of stress on the body, that is a causative factor for insulin resistance. Stress, you're not necessarily consuming any carbohydrates, but your body is making carbohydrates. So when you're stressed out, cortisol goes up. When cortisol goes up, you're in fight or flight mode. Your body thinks that you need to run away or you need to fight somebody. And so what does it do? It strategically increases your blood glucose so that you have energy ready to go for your muscles to run away. But most of our stressors these days are not physical in nature. They're mental, they're emotional, they're relational. And so your blood sugar still rises, but your muscles are not acting as a sponge to soak up and use that energy. So then insulin has to be released. Again, you're getting that spike of insulin to move the blood sugar into the cells. And a really great example of this is I had one of our Zivli members sent me a picture of her CGM data, continuous glucose monitor. And she was in like a speech program to help her public speak better, essentially. And so she had to give her first speech at like 9 a.m. And her fasting blood sugars were in the 90s at morning. And she did not eat before her speech. And you could just see this spike all the way up till 9 a.m. And then she gave her speech, and then they drastically dropped after she gave her speech and after that stress was over. So all the way up into the 170s. This is not just a little spike. That's like she had a couple cookies or like a bowl of ice cream spike just from the stress. So controlling our stress, learning how to control our mindset and our emotions can really improve our chances of not getting insulin resistance. And then sleep. So we have to be focusing on sleep. Chronic sleep deprivation is a form of stress on the body, number one. It will raise your baseline cortisol levels. But number two, when you're sleep deprived, you're going to be hungrier and you're going to be less likely to be full after a meal. And you're going to preferentially crave carbohydrates. That's something that I didn't mention. So cortisol, that hormone that's released when you're stressed, that will cause the release of a substance called NPY, which causes us to preferentially want carbohydrates and sweets. And that is why when you're stressed or when you're up late at night, you don't want to go and get another chicken breast. You want to go and get popcorn or chips or pretzels or crackers or candy or ice cream. You want the sugar and the quick carbs. So stress does that to you. So not only does it directly raise blood sugar levels because of the cortisol, it indirectly raises them because it's going to increase your cravings for carbohydrates and reduce your satiety if you're sleep deprived, making it way more likely you're going to overeat on the wrong things. So does that help explain a little bit more those basic causes of insulin resistance?
Yeah, for sure. And you can see how quickly the modern lifestyle and diet, there's going to be so many of these pieces that people need to work on, whether it be sleep, stress, diet, because of the modern conveniences and the go, go, go and the high stress. You can see how that number of 88% has come to be. It's a crazy world out there.
It is. And it's almost like a domino effect, because if we're not controlling our stress, if we're not managing our stress, we're never going to get rid of stress, but there are absolutely things that we can do to structure our day and our environment and our boundaries to reduce it. Well, then we're going to have a bad night of sleep. And if you have a bad night of sleep, you're going to have more carb cravings and less satiety. and you're probably not going to have as much energy to work out. So you might skip your workout, you might eat unhealthy, and then all of that is going to contribute to poor sleep again and more stress. So I think there's a negative domino effect, just like what I described, but I think there's also a positive domino effect. So if we're focusing on, well, what do we do about this? Like, okay, like check. I'm stressed out. I'm not sleeping. I'm eating too many carbs. I'm overeating. I'm eating late at night. Like I always say, think about the positive domino effect. If you focus on just one area at a time, which I suggest focusing on stress management and mindset first, because that's going to improve your sleep, which will have that positive domino effect. I think that's one of the best things that you can do is recognize like one change can have a ripple effect to make the subsequent changes easier.
Okay, so you said it's stress and sleep. That would be the top domino you'd recommend we start with?
Honestly, that's the top thing. Yeah. And that's so countercultural these days because many people will just start by cutting carbs. And there's a couple problems with that. Number one, if you're not adequately fueling and hydrating your body, cutting carbs is very difficult and you're going to have a lot of food cravings and it's just harder. So like, let's make it as easy as possible. And let's also have a long-term mindset. Let's recognize the goal is not to lose weight. The goal is to lose weight, improve your body composition, and maintain your results. The goal is not just to lower your blood sugar until your next blood test. The goal is to lower your blood sugar forever so that you can avoid the downstream consequences of diabetes. So we really first want to shift that mindset away from the instant gratification, away from, I have to see results within 2 weeks, otherwise this isn't working for me, and towards healthy, simple, doable, sustainable lifestyle changes. I like to say, don't try to jump from like lily pad A to lily pad T. Like just go from A to B and then B to C and then C to D. And I promise it's going to feel better. So one indicator that you've gone too far, you jumped too far, is that you feel stressed or overwhelmed by the lifestyle change or by the diet or whatever exercise regimen that you started. These changes should feel positive. They might feel a little bit challenging, but overall they should feel positive and doable and build your self-esteem, not crush it because you're not meeting these unrealistic goals and expectations that you've set on yourself. So I think reframing our mindset around, okay, the goal is this is a long-term game and I'm going to have a long-term mindset. I'm going to give myself grace and patience. I'm going to learn how to identify what is stressing me out and create boundaries around that, whether it's people or your working hours or how you're communicating with your spouse or your kids. Like all of these things can make a big difference. I think very simply starting with like a morning mindset routine. Maybe you're doing like a quick meditation, some positive affirmations. If you're a person of faith, reading some faith-based writings that are inspiring to you. You want to like put your glasses on for the day, put your armor on for the day, start your day on offense. Be clear about what 1 to 3 things am I going to commit to do today for my health, for me, not for anybody else. And so when we have that system of a daily mindset routine that's positive, that's affirming, that gives us clear guidance, our brain can follow through on that. So I think that's a good place to start. And then honestly, focusing on sleep, because when we're sleeping better and when we're less stressed out, all of the other dominoes can fall easier. So for that, I think blue light blockers are essential. I really enjoy watching TV before I go to bed. Not anything stressful, but that's kind of like my quality time with my husband, cuddle on the couch, get our blue light blockers on and just decompress from the day. And I tell you what, they look crazy because you have to get the orange ones. But what this does is we have to recognize blue light is stimulating cortisol to be released in the body. And cortisol is not just like, it's not just like a spike of it, right? It's just like a little bit to keep you energized, to keep you going, to keep you alert during the day. That's great. That's what we want. We want to be alert and awake and energized during the day, not at night. And so when blue light coming in through our phones, through our TVs, and by the way, like TVs emit as much blue light as the sun naturally does at high noon. So you're getting as much blue light if you're just watching TV with your eyes at 9 at night as if you were standing outside at noon. And that's really bad for our circadian rhythm because cortisol suppresses the production of melatonin, which is that hormone that makes you sleepy. So if we want melatonin to rise so that we can fall asleep and we can have deeper sleep and stay asleep more effectively, we need to block or lower cortisol levels. And one way that we can do that is by wearing blue light blockers. And you'll know they're working if you have like a coffee pot or a refrigerator with like a little blue light and you put the blue light blockers on, you should not be able to even notice that that light is on. So we're not talking about like the built-in blue light blockers to your clear lenses. This is different. This has to be amber colored or orange colored. And it might take a little bit of time. Yes, it's going to make your TV look weird. I don't care. Your better sleep is worth it, I promise. And I like to wear them at least 1 hour, but preferably like 1.5 to 2 hours before I want to be asleep. So I usually put the kids to bed, pop them on, head downstairs and hang out with my husband.
Okay, let's talk more about that period before you go to sleep. Some of the things you're doing to set yourself up for a great sleep.
Well, I think first of all, it's going to change based on the season. Some people need more sleep interventions than others. But if we're really talking about what are the most effective things that we can do, block blue light. You want your internal light environment, at least from a blue light standpoint, to match the external environment. If it's dark outside, it should be dark inside, preferably, and you should be blocking blue light. The second thing is don't spike your blood sugar right before bed. I really try to be done eating like 4 hours before I want to be asleep. So I want to be asleep by 9:30. That means we try to wrap up dinner by 5:30. So eating earlier in the night, going to sleep earlier, that's going to help. If I do have something to eat after that, like we were talking offline, I'm at the time of this recording 17 and a half weeks pregnant. So yes, my appetite is naturally a little bit bigger than what it normally would be. And I allow myself to have a snack if I'm really hungry. But I try to choose foods that are going to keep my insulin and blood sugar low. So maybe some of my homemade yogurt with some blackberries and pistachios. That's what I did the other night. I'm not having popcorn. I'm not having chips. I'm not having ice cream or anything that's going to spike my blood sugar, because when that happens, your body temperature rises, and we want a nice, cool, dark, calm, quiet environment to be able to sleep better. So that's the second tip, is really watch what you're eating before bed. Don't spike your blood sugar, and be done eating preferably 4 hours before you want to be asleep. I think another overlooked aspect is just temperature. We live in a 100-year-old farmhouse, and so there's very poor insulation and energy efficiency in this home. And we got an 8 sleep to put on top of our mattress. I think they have independent mattresses too, but we just got the cover so that we have dual control. Like my husband has his side of the bed, I have my side of the bed. I can make it as cool or warm as I want. And that has helped a lot to so I'm not so hot. That has helped a lot. So body temperature control, keeping your home a little bit cooler. You know how we talked about like the positive domino effect? We have our mindset routine, our sleep routine. The next one is water, actually, before any other dietary changes. And so when people start to drink water, often they don't have the habits built in their daily routine. And then they find themselves trying to catch up in the evenings, and then they're like up several times peeing. So I think biasing our water intake earlier in the day and then tapering off towards the end of the day, and trying to minimally drink water the couple of hours before you go to bed. So maybe you're just getting up like once or twice instead of, several times to go to the bathroom at night. That's really going to help. And then for people who really have disrupted sleep, I think one of the most important and beneficial things to do is to get morning sunlight. If you're like just way off, I don't know if you're a shift worker or just for whatever reason, like you just can't reset that circadian rhythm, resetting it first thing in the morning within like 90 minutes of the sun coming up, getting outside and getting natural light into your eyes, that's going to signal to your brain, okay, now it's morning. And then being very mindful of that light environment throughout the day to dim the lights at night, use the blue light blockers. So those are a few things. I know that there's always supplements that we can use, but I like to take the natural route as often as possible. Those would be some of my like top go-to sleep recommendations.
And then things people want to be aware of avoiding: alcohol before bed, caffeine too close to bedtime as well. You mentioned hydration
Yeah.
in general, but those are a little bit more nuanced.
I think that's important. And for me personally, I stopped drinking pretty much altogether, not just because I'm pregnant, but before that too. I just kind of asked myself, like, what is this really doing for me? I was never a big drinker, anyways. And I recognized this is absolutely just empty calories and might be increasing because I would always have like those like seltzer waters with alcohol. So they're kind of sweetened and it would make me want to eat more food. So I'm like, it's stimulating my appetite. It's not doing anything for me. I'm just done with it. But yeah, when you have alcohol before bed, that's going to cause a little bit of a sugar dip in the middle of the night and probably wake you up. And then caffeine, I also had to give up pretty much completely. I still have decaf coffee, which has a little bit. I have like cocoa powder, which has a little bit. But what I realized was I was waking up around 4 to 5 a.m. completely wired. And I did all of the other strategies and like my coffee was like the last straw to fall because I was holding on to that habit so hard. And I thought, all right, I've done everything else that I need to do and my sleep is still not improving. So I'm going to try this. And it was not a great experience. So I had 4 cups of coffee a day, cut it down to 2, cut it down to 1. And then when I switched from regular coffee to decaf, it still took 6 weeks for me to feel like my energy levels were what they were on caffeine. And I think another sign of like that caffeine is not working for you anymore, aside from interrupted sleep or waking up wired, is that afternoon crash. So if people like have caffeine in the morning and then they're just like crashing in the afternoon, even if they're eating healthy and they're not eating blood sugar spiking foods, that could be a sign that, hey, maybe it's the caffeine and that could be a habit to rethink. That definitely was happening to me. So it was not fun, but it's so much better to have good quality sleep and not have the afternoon energy crash. So I do encourage everybody to stop drinking. If you feel like the caffeine is an issue for you, just there's decaf options. So I'm glad that you reminded me of those too.
All right. And coming back to hydration as a whole, you mentioned we want to prioritize that. Prioritize having that earlier in the day if you can, so you're not getting up to pee during the night.
Yep.
Is there any connection there specifically to insulin resistance
Yeah.
and maintaining our hydration levels?
Yeah. So if you think about it, a lot of people who have insulin resistance are dehydrated. They have more concentrated blood. So your blood sugar is measured on like milligrams per deciliter. So if we increase the volume of blood by drinking more water, you're naturally going to dilute the sugar in your blood and have healthier blood sugar readings. So I'm a big fan of drinking a ton of water. And as a general rule of thumb, you want your urine to be clear or very light yellow. And I don't want you to just be drinking Diet Coke all day saying that you're hydrating yourself. That you're not. And then we haven't talked about fasting yet, but I think it's important to recognize mineral deficiencies are very common. Some of the more common ones with people who have insulin resistance would be like a magnesium deficiency. That's common in a lot of people. And so, especially if you're using intermittent fasting, but honestly, I supplement with electrolytes about daily, is that's going to help restore the minerals in your body. So minerals are these compounds that we get from eating food that help our cells essentially run how they're supposed to run. And when we have mineral deficiencies, you're going to have symptoms like muscle cramps is a big one, especially for like sodium and magnesium deficiencies. You might have some sleep disturbances, brain fog and fatigue is a sign, some headaches. And often when you just supplement with electrolytes, you're going to start to feel a lot better. So there's a lot of different brands on the market. I mix it up personally. I know LMNT is a popular one, but they cost like over $2 a stick, and that's just a little bit above what I want to spend. So, but really focusing to be sure that your electrolytes don't have added sugar and that they have a good amount of magnesium, because magnesium, again, is just one of those that a lot of people are deficient in.
Are you familiar with Rick Johnson?
Um, is he the author of like Nature Wants Us to Be Fat?
Exactly.
Yes.
As we're talking about this, it got me thinking about a piece of his work where, and I may end up butchering this, but I'll paraphrase that when we're dehydrated, we're more likely to convert glucose to fructose in our system.
Hmm.
So
Interesting.
just another layer on the hydration piece and the sugars and tying it all together.
Yeah, his book was a good one. I don't know if you've read that one, but that was an interesting one because it's not, there was a line in his book that's like, it's not just about the fructose that we eat, it's about the fructose that our body makes. And that's another big reason to stop drinking alcohol is because the ethanol is converted into fructose. Another reason to stop eating glucose in a bolus, like a bunch of pasta or a bunch of bread, because excess glucose can start to be converted to fructose too. So for anybody really interested in that stuff, that was a pretty good book.
Yeah, and I think it's the polyol pathway that talks about being dehydrated and converting that glucose to fructose. So if you think you're avoiding fructose, but you're still consuming starches,
Or alcohol.
you might be, or I guess alcohol too, you might be converting. So a lot of different intricacies here. But again, coming back to what you said before, starting with that first domino to not overwhelm people, which again is the mindset and sleep. And then now you did mention fasting. I want to move into diet again and fasting. What are the first steps for somebody who is in that range of insulin resistance? Their body is starting to feel the effects of that. Let's talk about what they want to look at within the diet.
Yeah, sure. Um, so let's start with diet first, and then maybe we can move into fasting. So there's different ways to view this. And I would say if somebody is just trying to prevent insulin resistance, they can tolerate a little bit higher carbohydrate intake. So maybe like 20% of their daily calories can come from carbohydrates. So I did the math before the interview, and I hope my math is right. So if you're eating like 2,000 calories a day, that's about 100 grams of net carbohydrates, which I would also recommend space out evenly at your meals. So about 30 grams of net carbohydrates per meal. That way you don't have like one huge bolus and like a huge glucose spike. Now, with that percentage of carbohydrates, the protein should be pretty stable, whether we are in the prevention or like the maintenance or the prevention or the reversal phase. So in maintenance, like if you're okay, let's start with maintenance. Maintenance is about 20% from carbohydrates. Prevention is closer to like 15%. So prevention is like 75 grams of net carbs a day if you're having, 2,000 calories. Reversal is closer to 50 grams. So closer to that ketogenic range of net carbs per day. So the more metabolically healthy you are, the more carbohydrates you can tolerate. The more diabetic you are, the less carbohydrates you can tolerate. So as you reverse insulin resistance, you may be able to gradually increase that carbohydrate amount. But honestly, unless you're an athlete or unless you're like fueling endurance activities, I don't really see a need to go over 100 grams of net carbs per day. Even if you're, just like me, just like somebody who's healthy, I rarely do that unless I'm having an exception day or exercising a ton that day. So that's the carbohydrate. Now, protein is going to be stable, whether we're in maintenance, preventing, or reversing. So that's going to be about 30% of your calories coming from protein. And a really simple way to estimate that is about 1 gram of protein per pound of ideal body weight. And there are different ways to calculate that ideal body weight. This is the only reason I use a BMI chart, like that body mass index chart, is if you just Google BMI chart, you'll see a chart pull up, find your height, find your weight, and then find like the normal or the green zone, the healthy weight, and then choose a number in there. So for me, I'm 5'8". So my ideal body weight is close to like 135 to 140 pounds. So I'm aiming for 135 to 140 grams of protein every day, split between my meals. So it's important to recognize that that dose of protein is important to stimulate your muscle growth. And 30 grams of a complete protein source like eggs, steak, chicken, seafood, that kind of thing, that's going to have about 3 grams of the essential amino acid leucine. And that will stimulate or trigger your muscle synthesis. So your muscles to start to grow and repair. But a problem that people do is they underdose their protein. They're having like a bowl of Special K that has like no more than 10 grams of protein. And they're thinking that they're having a healthy breakfast when there's a ton of carbs in that. It's pretty low in protein. You're not getting that. You're missing the opportunity to stimulate your muscle growth. And if you're not stimulating it, you're losing it. So that's important. So we've covered kind of carbohydrate amount, protein amount, and then fat. That fat and carbohydrate ratio is really what can be manipulated. So, if you're in the maintenance phase and you're getting 30% of your calories from protein and 20% from carbohydrate, then you could get 50% from fat. And then that ratio would gradually increase a little bit. The lower carb you get, the higher fat you can get. So does that help we can dig into the foods and the specific things, but I kind of wanted to help with that overview so people can understand, all right, if I'm very diabetic or if I'm really wanting to reverse this condition, I got to keep my net carbs to 30 grams or less a day. If I have these risk factors, but I'm not there yet, I can have, maybe 75 grams of net carbs a day. And then if you're somebody like me, I have many relatives with diabetes. I know I'm at risk for it. So I try to keep my net carbs between like 80 and 100 a day. And then my protein is always steady, 135 to 140 grams a day. And then my fat calories are what has the most wiggle room. Calories do matter. Unfortunately, I wish they didn't, but they really do. So all of this to say, you want to keep your calories in a range that's going to help you maintain a healthy body weight and composition as well. Eating too many healthy calories will still contribute to weight gain. And over time, those fat cells will start to get larger and larger.
That all makes sense. Really clear. So coming back to the carbs, depending on how metabolically unhealthy we are, we want to go lower on that spectrum. Any reason for somebody who is type 2 diabetic or really metabolically challenged to not cut them out and do a carnivore or carnivore-ish type diet for a period of time to gain their metabolic health back quicker?
I have several thoughts on this. And this is a big old YouTube rabbit hole that people can go down. The carnivore diet, the lion diet, which is like essentially steak and salt and water. I always come back to sustainability and what's mentally healthy for the person, because I don't think if it's mentally healthy, it's sustainable. So I think that a keto or a carnivore-ish approach could be okay as like a reset, like a mental reset, because these processed foods, man, they really have a grip on our psyche and they cause food addiction. And so I think that there is benefit from like a short period of time to really narrow your food selections to those most nutrient dense, to really let your cells, like just to give it a break, just to give your cells, give your pancreas a break. I think long term, there may be some gut health implications. Again, if you're going way down the YouTube rabbit holes, they're always going to have an argument against what I'm saying, and they'll say this is all fine. But I think as a reset, it can be okay. For me, I couldn't eat steak and salt for the rest of my life and maintain my sanity. I wouldn't want to. I don't have a physiological need to. I don't have an autoimmune condition that would benefit. So I just really enjoy a more flexible approach because that's what's sustainable for me. But it can be a tool to reset, and just give your metabolism a break, essentially. But I caution people from using it as a quick fix without understanding the habits that got you to where you are in the first place. Because if it's not a sustainable approach, you have to always consider, well, what am I doing after this? And at some point, I'm sure we're going to get to weight loss medications. And that's kind of where I'm going with this. that it can go for fasting too. Like, okay, I'm just not going to eat for 5 days and I'm going to fix my metabolism. Okay, great. But then what are you going to do after the fast? So keeping that in mind always, that there are so many different tools in our toolbox to heal your metabolism and to lose weight, but you cannot circumvent the required mindset and lifestyle changes that it takes to really get and stay healthy, lose and maintain that weight loss. So it's a tool, but I don't think it's the end all be all.
And you did mention ketosis, and somebody on a carnivore or carnivore-ish type diet will likely be there all the time, or at least a lot of the time.
Yeah.
How do you feel about ketosis in a broader sense? Because there are, cognitive benefits, there are anti-inflammatory benefits of ketones. And maybe this fits in for you when we get into fasting and having periods of time where you're not eating, where you're dipping into that on a regular basis from a meal frequency versus what you're eating specifically.
You're
So talk
exactly
about
right.
ketosis and how that fits in for you if it does.
I really enjoy, like, I think ketosis is great. I'm just saying the type of lifestyle it takes to be in ketosis all the time is not one that I could happily sustain. So that's why I take a little bit more moderate approach. But you're right, like, it's very anti inflammatory. I think for people with cognitive impairment, it can be life changing. Have you had Dr. Georgia Eat on your show yet?
I have. She's great.
Gosh, she's so
Her
great. I
book's amazing
loved
too.
her book. Like, Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind. So for people interested in like a keto or carnivore-ish lifestyle, I highly recommend her book. She's so gracious, she's so knowledgeable, and she really breaks it down to remove any fears or barriers around the safety of ketosis. But she does such a great job in her book explaining that your brain can become insulin resistant too, which means it's going to be resistant to using glucose for energy. But your brain doesn't need insulin to use ketones for energy. And so ketones are that byproduct of fat metabolism that you're getting into if you're just on a keto diet or you're primarily carnivore. You're going to primarily be generating ketones for energy, which your brain can use without insulin. So it's kind of like this backup switch for people with cognitive impairment to be able to reactivate their brain. But then I loved her book too because it talks about the benefits of ketosis for depression, anxiety, ADHD, schizophrenia, a lot of those neurological based conditions that people are just being given medications for. She really presents a strong case for the benefits of a ketogenic diet to help reduce that neural inflammation and give your brain an alternative fuel source. So I'm a big fan of her, big fan of ketosis in general. But you're right, there are other ways to get into ketosis without being on a keto diet. And that's one of the reasons I'm a big fan of intermittent fasting. And I miss it. But it's good and bad. I can kind of talk about some of the things that I've learned this pregnancy, not being able to intermittently fast. You can have this lower carbohydrate diet, especially if you're physically active and you do some moderate fasting. You're going to be dipping into ketosis a little bit every day, probably. I just love it. I love experimenting with, some days I'm lower carb, some days I'm fasting more. I think it's fun. It's fun to check your ketones and see where they're at. So that's the benefit of the fasting. But I wanted to talk about nutrition first because I don't want people to use fasting as this end all be all cure. It's very effective. I think it's one of the most effective things that we can do to reverse insulin resistance, but you can't fast forever. Like, eventually you're going to need to eat. And if you're eating unhealthy foods, you're undoing some of the benefits that you got from fasting. So I think understanding how to properly fuel your body is a great stepping stone before you start fasting longer than 12 to 14 hours a day. So I really recommend people just start with like 3 solid, well-balanced meals a day. And I don't say well-balanced like the diabetes plate method. That is not well-balanced. That is just 3/4 of plates of carbs and some protein, no fats, which we just talked about. And then work into fasting. So that would be my recommendation for how can you dip into ketosis and get some of the benefits without living a structured, strict keto diet or carnivore lifestyle.
There's a lot of different variables here to look at where everybody's different. You mentioned Georgia Eads' work and people with mental health challenges. That may dictate using some of these tools we're talking about in different ways for a different person. And yourself right now, where you mentioned changing up your fasting because you're pregnant. So we go through different phases of life. It's not like we're going to give a prescription here that's going to be all inclusive, but we're going to share the tools. And then you need to decide with your personal makeup and where you're at along your health journey, how you're going to use those. And
Absolutely.
depending on how many carbs you're having within your diet, you might want to fast more. Or if you're fasting less, you might need to cut your carbs down. So there's all these intricate layers to all of this. And I just wanted to highlight it right here.
I think, yeah, one of my other favorite things about intermittent fasting is it allows you to be more flexible with your diet, just like you said. And it's like a mental and a physiological reset from food. So it's one of my favorite strategies to use over the holidays. Like if you overeat at one meal, you fast a little bit more the next day. Let your digestive system have a little bit longer of a break. Let your psyche have a little bit longer of a break, especially if you had some sugar. But for me during this pregnancy, what I realized was I was overeating at dinner, and then I would usually fast longer the next morning. No big deal. That was just kind of my normal eating cycle. I just eat more in the evenings out of habit, not necessarily because that's the best way to do it. And so it's been an opportunity to really dial in that natural tendency that I have to overeat in the evenings because I no longer have that intermittent fasting lever to pull during an overeat. Like I just can't do that anymore because you shouldn't be fasting when you're pregnant. You don't really, obviously it's a growth period, so you don't want to deprive your baby of nutrients. You also don't really want to be in a fat burning mode because your body stores a lot of toxins in your fat cells, and you don't want the fat to release those toxins and then get into your baby's system through your bloodstream. So I'm missing it, and I will look forward to when I can do some more fasting again, but it's been a good opportunity to dial in other habits.
Tying in insulin resistance, your pregnancy, and then bringing Rick Johnson back in and his work talking about bears in hibernation and how the physiology changes so they become more insulin resistant. It gets me thinking about this unique time in your life where you're building anabolic. Any info there on the body becoming more insulin resistant as you're pregnant and how that fits into this unique time in your life?
Sure. Well, I think that I don't know the exact stats, but I did a podcast episode recently on it. And I think at least around 10% of women develop gestational diabetes. And I thought it was over 40% of women. I think it might have been significantly higher than that, even gain more weight than the recommended amount during pregnancy. And when I was pregnant with my son, I just didn't know this stuff yet, my first child. And I actually had 2 banana splits for lunch one day when I was pregnant with him and texted my best friends. I'm like, you guys, I just had 2 banana splits. I'm living my best pregnant life. Pig emoji, pig emoji, pig emoji. I had no idea. So I gained about 40 pounds with him. And I had natural childbirths for both him and my second child. And it was so hard. And my OB, I don't even know if we talked about weight gain much. I don't think that we did. I think we did with my next baby. And it was hard because he was a big baby. So when a woman gains weight, yes, your baby is probably going to be bigger. And yes, it is harder to push out a bigger baby. So the next time around, I thought, okay, I was starting to learn a lot just in general for this business and my own health. And I talked to my OB, I said, the first pregnancy I had, that was a tough delivery, man. I didn't even take Tylenol, and I should have known better. And I just had, it was tough. And I said, how can we not do that again? How can it be natural, but also be easier? And he's like, well, keep your weight gain to 30 pounds or less, because once you're over 30 pounds, it gets harder and your baby just gets bigger. And I was like, okay, just kind of blind trust. So I gained about 30 pounds with my daughter, and she was so much easier to deliver because she was over a pound lighter than Dawson was. And I just, had less maternal complications and was able to heal faster, and it was great. And so for this baby, first off, I gained weight a lot faster. We knew right away. I don't know if like third baby, my body just knows what's going on. And so I gained weight a lot faster. And I thought, okay, I better get a control on this, put on a CGM. And I was shocked at just like how being pregnant, even in the first like few weeks for me personally, raised my baseline blood sugar levels. Just because, right? Because it's physiological insulin resistance. Your body wants to have slightly higher blood sugars to allow that glucose to be able to go to the baby so it can grow. So I've had to kind of modify my diet, modify my activity plan to still try to keep my blood sugar levels in as optimal range as possible. So I've used a CGM for sure to keep an eye on that. But I know at least one person who felt like she was eating healthy, felt like she was exercising, probably started a little bit overweight going into her pregnancy and developed gestational diabetes and then had to wear a CGM. And I'm like, why are we not starting all pregnant women on a continuous glucose monitor, educating her about what is healthy and what is not healthy and how can we control our blood sugars and our weight gain during pregnancy? I don't think that physicians are talking with their pregnant patients enough about this. And so I've had to lower my carbohydrate intake and really, again, watch the portions. Like I can't get away with overeating. My blood sugar will just like go higher than it otherwise would when I'm not pregnant. So it's been interesting. And a CGM definitely is one of the best tools to understand your body better and understand what foods and what portions will spike your blood sugar more than others. Also, the huge benefit of just walking after you eat. Like if you want to talk about a blood sugar hack, like walking after you eat will help some of the glucose from your meal just soak into your muscles because they're using it. So that's one of my favorite tools right now is just being active throughout the day, especially after I eat, has helped to keep those blood sugar levels in a good range.
While we're on hacks, what are some of the other things people can introduce? Say they're eating at a family member's house or it's the holidays. They know they're going to have more carbs in a meal or a couple of meals than they usually do. There's a lot of different things on the web. You don't really know what's true, what's not. What are some of the other things that work to help stabilize blood sugar?
Yeah. So for one, again, walking after meals, that's going to be one of the most effective things you can do. I also started a berberine supplement. So there's some evidence stating that berberine can help lower blood sugars. I started a magnesium supplement. These are in addition to my multivitamin. Apple cider vinegar, surprisingly, like taking 1 or 2 tablespoons in the morning, or like with one of your higher carb meals or at night. So all of the above or just one of the above, whatever you want to do, dilute it in some water. And then I suggest drinking it through a straw so the acid doesn't hurt your teeth. You might want to plug your nose when you do it because it can be kind of potent, however you want to do it. But that's going to help pre-digest some of those starches essentially so that you have a lower blood sugar response. For the holidays, I like to make my mashed potatoes the day before and then let them refrigerate overnight. So that's a little hack that helps kind of reconfigure the starch in the potatoes to a slower digesting starch so they don't spike your blood sugar as much even when they're reheated. You lose some of the benefit, but there's still some benefit there. And then eating the starches last. That's another huge, huge tip. Like if you notice, if you're going to have like a piece of pie or a Christmas cookie, don't just have it for a snack. Like eat a full protein dose. So a good amount of, turkey, get some fat in that meal, get some fiber in that meal, and then a little bit later have the sugar. That's almost like rolling out the red carpet to slow the sugar response and to keep it low. I experimented with that recently. I had like 3 small chocolate chip cookies, like 20 minutes after dinner, and my blood sugar didn't really do anything. And I'm like, cool. Like that was great. Whatever I'm doing is working. And I walked on the treadmill a little bit too, but not much. So it really does work to have the starch and the sugar last, have the potatoes last, have the corn last, have the dessert last. don't have it in isolation, but have it after you've had your protein, your fiber, and your fat, then have the starch and sugar. I think another great tip is the portions. Like when I'm going to make my plate for Thanksgiving, one thing I think about is I want to see white on my plate. I do not want to like stack this plate up full of food like to Mount Everest so that there's no white on my plate still. I want to see white around each individual thing that I put on there. And then also like you just a few bites of mashed potatoes. You don't need like a whole spoonful of mashed potatoes. So you can still enjoy all of the foods, but reduce the portion sizes of the starches and the sugars and increase the portion sizes, depending on your normal portion, of the protein and the fiber. So I try to load up on like the yummy salads, the meat, that kind of stuff, and then smaller portions of everything else.
All right. So within the blood sugar realm, you mentioned berberine. We talked about electrolytes before. Related to blood sugar, insulin resistance, or otherwise, what other supplements do you take or could people consider?
So I don't take any other besides a prenatal vitamin right now. I usually always take that and electrolytes. I added the magnesium and I added the berberine just for magnesium, everything. It helps with so many things. It helps with your muscles. It helps with your sleep. It helps with your metabolic support and glucose regulation. Chromium can also be another common one that people might want to consider supplementing because it's important in blood sugar regulation. If somebody's a vegan or a vegetarian, I think having like a branched chain amino acid supplementation with their meals can help just to kind of bump up that amino acid profile of the meal to make it more likely they're going to stimulate the muscle. So again, we want muscle for glucose metabolism to prevent insulin resistance. So supplements that can help build muscle are good too. I supplement with protein powder. I consider protein powder a supplement. So I have a protein shake about every day. In the past, I've supplemented with creatine. I think I did maybe like 5 grams a day, and there's different dosing schedules and philosophies there. I don't know that I really saw a difference with the creatine. I'm not sure, but I've done that in the past too. So in general, I think we should be trying to get all of our nutrients from whole foods, but those are some of the supplements that you can use if you feel like you need a little bit more of a boost.
When we were talking about Georgia Eat and ketones, you talked about insulin resistance of the brain, which something I wanted to bring up with you is insulin resistance in different areas of the body. And as somebody is coming into this, hopefully not, but if they are, how that progresses. We talked about
Interesting.
fat cells and them causing the inflammation through the body and depositing fat in different areas, coming back to early in the conversation. But as somebody's going down that continuum years and years, are there certain areas of the body that become insulin resistant first, typically?
That's
Or does it have
interesting.
more systemic effect as it comes on?
I would say there's probably some systemic effects, but just thinking about how the body works and like what tissues metabolize glucose the most or are involved in that process, the liver and the muscles are probably two of the most prominent organs that develop insulin resistance just because they're kind of a downstream effect of that blood. Like all the blood is passed through the liver. And then glucose is the primary deposit or muscle is the primary deposit for glucose. So I'd say those two places would probably be good to develop, like to look into regarding the downstream insulin resistance that develops after it's in the fat cells. I'm a physical therapist by trade, and I loved anatomy and dissecting the body. And I always like to say, like, we like to see marbling in our steak, not our muscle. So we like to see it in a cow, but not in us. So if you were like cut somebody's muscle open, you could really see if it was just like mushy and like just had fat all around it, or if it was more dense and red. Same for the liver. Like you can really tell if a liver tissue is healthy and really that dark red dense, or if it was just like mottled with fat in it. So those two places. And then Dr. Lisa Mosconi, she's the author of the XX Brain, and I think has at least one more book. she, described very well that Alzheimer's disease starts like in midlife. This is not just a condition that happens overnight. So just like diabetes, like high blood sugars, your insulin is rising in the background for 10 to 20 years before you're going to see that downstream effect. Your brain is changing for decades before you actually see the effects of memory issues or judgment issues, like the effects or the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So I do believe that, I would assume the body would protect the brain, honestly. Like, it needs the brain the most. So I think that the insulin resistance probably starts a little bit later up there compared to like liver and muscle tissue would be my best guess.
And when it comes to the fact that insulin resistance affects nearly everything, if not everything in the body, and it's a root cause of so many different diseases, is the reason for that the fact that when insulin raises and is chronically elevated, it's so inflammatory?
Yeah, I mean, in part, but also just yes, essentially. The high blood sugar levels are also inflammatory. So the glucose itself, when it's high, is inflammatory. The insulin, when it's high, is inflammatory. And we know inflammation is really another root cause of all of the conditions that we've been talking about. So, when we're talking about those signs of insulin resistance, one thing I didn't mention is joint pain. And that's a big one. Like, again, geriatric physical therapists, how many people have I seen with a knee replacement or a shoulder replacement or back pain? Well, when the cells like that are in your joint, so supposed to be creating like that grease to help your joint move smoothly, when those become insulin resistant, they start to produce inflammatory compounds and cause joint pain. When the cells that line your joints and are supposed to create like cartilage to help them roll smoothly, when those are insulin resistant, they don't do that. They produce inflammatory cartilage. So more and more, even things like osteoarthritis is being considered a metabolic condition, not a disease of wear and tear on the body. So I think that that's just another example, right, of how inflammation and insulin resistance go hand in hand to create damaging effects on our bodies.
Given the fact that the symptoms are so far reaching, we got into a lot of them early in the conversation, and you just brought another one in here. At what point would you recommend to somebody to get some objective testing done? Because again,
Right.
also, this is affecting so many people. And then the other caveat to throw in too is, does it really change the way we go about living? And if it doesn't, does it really matter if we test? So there's a lot there. And I'm just curious, when you're working with somebody,
Yeah.
does everybody get tested? Or how do you know when you get to that point where it's like, we should get a baseline data here on, say, fasting insulin so we can work from there?
Absolutely. I think I wish they would start in kids. I mean, how many kids are developing childhood obesity and type 2 diabetes that used to be called adult onset diabetes is now more common in kids than ever. So I think we should even be checking it in children, but at least part of an annual physical. It is not part of a standard blood draw. So if you're going in for your annual exam with your physician, they're probably not checking fasting insulin. And I think it would change behavior because I think that there's a lot of people who think that that first indicator of a problem is your A1C or your fasting glucose. And there's a lot of false confidence that's being developed because, well, I'm not that bad yet. I'm not diabetic yet. And so we need to reframe that first indicator, which should be fasting insulin, because that's going to give you 1 to 2 decades of a heads up that, hey, we need to make some lifestyle changes or you're on the road for type 2 diabetes here. Is it something that we need to check like every 3 months? I do not think so. Personally, I don't think so. But as a regular part of your physical, I think it would be a good idea.
And then within that realm, there's also the HOMA IR and the craft test, which you brought up last time we were chatting.
Yeah,
How do you look at, for an individual person, which of those they should use?
that's a good question. I think that the first line that I would go for is just a fasting insulin test. Ideal is going to be less than 6. So if you're over 6, there's not really any cutoffs for like what's pre-diabetic or what's type 2 diabetic from an insulin standpoint. The HOMA IR it just combines, it's an equation that uses insulin and glucose, and then you divide it, by a certain number depending on if you're in the States or elsewhere. You can just Google HOMA IR calculator and plug in your fasting insulin and your fasting glucose. That'll spit out kind of a marker of insulin resistance. That's going to be probably a little bit more accurate than just a fasting insulin because it also includes a glucose level. So you have kind of one more marker. Because remember, fasting insulin is just like glucose. It's going to go up and down all day long based on what you're eating. It's one point in time. So I think another probably most beneficial test for insulin resistance and catching diabetes before blood sugar will is the Kraft test. And that's essentially like an oral glucose tolerance test, which is what many pregnant women get, which I am refusing. I refused it in my second pregnancy. I'm refusing it again. I'm like, if you guys want to see my CGM data, I'll send it over, but I am not drinking, 75 grams of glucose or something, just like a king size candy bar worth of sugar. I'm like, I'm fine. We're not going to do that. But if you're concerned and you want to do it, you have a bolus of glucose. They check your fasting glucose and your fasting insulin when you're fasted. And then like around 30, maybe 30, but for sure 60 minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later. And what that gives you, it gives you a glucose curve, which may look normal. And that's why this is important. Like you could have normal glucose and a normal A1C and still be at a very high risk of developing prediabetes or type 2 diabetes because you're also going to see what your insulin is doing. And you want that insulin curve to pretty much match that glucose curve. It'll be, it won't like match exactly, but if it's up high and if it stays high for a long time, that's a sign of insulin resistance right there. So there's different levels on like how just different people like different ways of testing. They like different specificity. I think a good fasting insulin test is a nice kind of biomarker to start with.
Okay. Earlier, you brought up the new-ish weight loss drugs. I want to get to those, but let's start with weight loss in general. And as a foot in the door, a lot of people here are likely here because of the weight loss piece. And hopefully, as they hear more about what we're talking about today, they stick around for all the different health benefits they're going to get living this lifestyle. But for somebody who right now feels like, I'm overweight, I've tried everything, I'm looking for some new ideas, anything other than what we shared so far for that person that really wants to cut down on their weight and then hopefully move into these other aspects.
I always kind of smile, unfortunately, and feel like I've tried everything because usually that means they have kind of tried a lot of different diets. And they've tried a lot of things for maybe like 2 or 4 weeks and then they stop because it wasn't sustainable in the first place. So I just wanted to extend hope for people that do feel like that you've tried everything and nothing is working for you. Like there is a solution. You just haven't found it yet. And you're not a failure. And everything that you have tried thus far is just taking you one step closer to that solution. So I would really encourage you to start on that mindset, give yourself grace, give yourself patience, be sure that you are in a supportive environment to be able to make these required lifestyle changes to see the results that you want. And when it comes to weight loss, right, energy does matter. Calories do matter, but there's so many different rabbit holes that we could go down for that. If you're in an energy deficit, you're naturally going to be lowering your insulin levels because insulin is kind of a storage hormone, right? It is a storage hormone. But if you're not eating enough to have anything left to store, your insulin levels will naturally stay low. So you can't really have a calorie deficit without also having like an insulin deficit, which is what we want a lot of the times. So I want to just encourage people, an energy deficit is required if you want to strictly lose weight. I would also encourage you to not only focus on the weight loss, but focus on body recomposition, and sustainable weight loss. So that's the biggest mindset shift that I want people to make is if you learn nothing else, if your goal is to lose weight, I want you to be eating adequate protein, 1 gram of protein per pound of ideal body weight per day, and resistance training at least twice a week. That is going to help you maintain muscle mass, even if you're in a caloric deficit, so that whatever weight you do lose is more likely to stay off, because I cannot tell you how many people have lost the same 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds multiple times in their life. And it's because they're not going about it in a way that is sustainable and that's healthy for their metabolism. So they just end up slowing their metabolism down, returning to their old ways, and then putting on more weight that they lost. So 2 pivotal things: protein intake and resistance training, okay, with some sort of energy deficit. From there, you're probably going to see faster results on a lower carbohydrate approach, like what we've been talking about today, just because your insulin levels will drop lower faster and you won't be able to store as much as you want to eat. Like you can just, it's like someone that goes on keto and they just like melt away. That's because their insulin levels are very low and they're actively in a fat burning state. So it's not like I have, this big beef against weight loss medications, but I think that they're being misused a little bit by people in the sense that they want an easy way out or they want a shortcut. I don't think that's the right mindset to take with them. I think that if you're not getting enough protein and resistance training, the medications are a waste of your money, because whatever weight you lose is probably going to be coming back on. I think that for a lot of people, they can be a nice jump start or a bridge. But from physicians that I've interviewed for my podcast, the ones that I really trust say it's probably best to use them in a low dosage in conjunction with lifestyle changes, like what the 2 that I talked about, especially, and then have an end date, have an off plan. There's a lot of companies out there that are just kind of like doing it on a subscription based, kind of a higher dose on subscription based, and that's going to increase your risk for side effects like nausea, gastroparesis, honestly, just like malnutrition. So I know some people are on them and they're just like, I'm so full, I can't even like eat anything. Well, that's a problem, because then you're not getting enough protein to maintain your muscle mass as you lose weight, and you're just going to be slowing your metabolism. So then the other issue is the rebound effect. So when people stop the medications, if they haven't been working on lifestyle changes and mindset changes on the way down, they sometimes have this rebound appetite to these medications, essentially like suppress your appetite and make you want to eat less. That's the goal of these medications. So the rebound effect is you lose that and you have a bigger appetite and you want to eat more. So if you haven't maintained, again, your muscle on the way down and you start to eat more, you have a slower metabolism, you're going to put more fat on. So I think that they should be used with caution. They should be used with a physician who has shared goals. They should not be a substitute for the quote unquote real work of weight loss and behavior change. And they should be, honestly, they should be a tool, but not the end all be all. And I've heard 2 people this summer, I heard say, oh, my doctor said that I could just wait a little bit longer and then my A1C would get a little bit higher and then I would qualify for GLP-1s. And that's some people's mentality, is they're just like waiting to get sick enough to take a medication to fix it. And that is not the right mindset to have. So I have a lot of mixed feelings about these medications, but my overall one is eat your protein, do your resistance training, and low dose, try to have an expiration date so that you can maintain your weight in as natural way as possible without the medication.
Have you heard any of this talk about allulose having similar effects to GLP-1s,
I
but
have
more
not
short
heard
term?
that. That's interesting. Tell me about it.
I'm no expert in this area. It's just something that I've talked to a couple people on the show, and it seems to have an overlap of effects, but to be very short term. And the difference between that and the drugs is they're very long acting. But I also want to caveat that where people need to be careful, where even if things are in the natural world, when we start really hacking and bringing these things in, they can still act as band-aids we want to make sure, and this is, I know what you're big on, getting to the root of this and forming the habits and getting the satisfaction that comes with putting in the work and getting the results that you will get if you do over time and you do it the right way.
I think that's one of the most underspoken of benefits to doing it. I don't want to say there's a right way or a wrong way, but kind of the hard way is like you develop self-confidence and self-esteem, and problem solving skills and resilience and self-compassion that you can't get from an injection. And I think the best way to prove that is to put on a 30-pound backpack, put on a backpack, put some weight in it, and go walk around for 5 minutes. And then take that backpack off. And then see if you feel more confident and see if you feel more self-esteem. See if you feel like you have any better problem solving or resilience. You're not going to. You just lost 30 pounds. It's a physical effect. But a lot of people attribute losing physical weight to a mental effect. And there's some truth in that. Like, there's some truth that when you're 50 pounds lighter, it's easier to move around. It's easier to put your clothes on. You might feel like you look better, but it's an inside out job in the long run. And so I don't want people to rob themselves of the opportunity to develop these really important and satisfying skills, to put in the work, to not get the result, and to push through and continue to do the work anyways. And that's where we develop resilience is when you're putting in the work, you're not getting the result and you don't care. It's like you care, but you don't care because you care enough about your long-term health and the process that the immediate results start to mean less and less because it's more about who you're becoming along the way. And you just, again, you can't get that from an injection.
I feel like a big piece that we can provide here for people is the hope piece. And you brought this in when you're talking about weight loss, where for people that don't realize that they can reverse this and they have the power to do it, how are they ever going to get started?
Right.
So let's expand that hope piece beyond the
Mhm.
weight loss to the bigger conversation we're having today about insulin resistance and talk about what you've seen with people and how quickly they can reverse this silent killer we've been talking about.
Yeah. It just depends honestly on the quickness of it. Everybody's going to be different. I've had clients get off blood pressure medications that they were taking for, years and years and years in just a couple of months. We've had people get off cholesterol medications, blood sugar medications. I would say a couple months is the minimum for what you would probably want to do safely and sustainably to get off a medication. Um, Happens all the time, like all the time that these stories of transformation are happening within our membership, but also just like all over the place, all over the place. Like I think YouTube comments are kind of a dangerous rabbit hole. I don't go down them a lot, but sometimes they can be really inspirational, people sharing their stories. But the speed of change will depend upon your discipline to your program, your individual program, your physiology, your age, all of the factors like your stress, your sleep, your physical activity, your nutrition, your fasting. There's a lot of different pillars that you're going to want to implement. But the hope is that there's time. And I say that with caution because some people listen and are like, I'm 70 years old. I don't have a lot of time left. Like I need to do this, hip hop right now. And don't have that mindset, like plan as if you're going to live till you're 90. Don't try to get all this done by the time you're 71. But hope is important. And I think that physicians often don't give enough hope and they set expectations too low. So unfortunately, I don't think that the physician's office is a really great place to get hope anymore. It's not their fault. I just think that they have limited time to really build that rapport and that relationship and educate you on these changes. Did you know that in 2023, the American Diabetes Association came out with like a new standard of care that said it's okay for somebody, I think age 65 and older, who has few chronic health illnesses and intact, like brain health essentially, to have an A1C of 7 to 7.5. Did you hear that?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, which means the new standard of care is diabetes. And that's why if you're talking to somebody who's diabetic and like my dad or my uncle, for example, and I'll say, "How was your last check?" And they're like, "Good. My doctor said my A1C is under 7." And I'm like, "Okay, well, anything over 5.6 is pre-diabetic." And so I think that as the population gets sicker and more overweight, it's becoming normalized, and we're becoming desensitized, and physicians especially are becoming desensitized to illness and what optimal health really looks like. One of our members lost 50 pounds, and she was at a church function, got rid of like her blood pressure medication, feeling great, no more joint pain. And someone at the church function said, "Wow, you're so thin. Are you sick?" And she was like, "No, I've actually never been healthier." And so, again, that's just an example of we're becoming desensitized to what healthy bodies look like. And we're getting used to seeing people who are overweight, people who are on multiple medications. And there's so much hope to reverse this. You can reverse insulin resistance, but again, I've heard physicians tell their patients you can't reverse insulin resistance. We had one of our members tried to get her physician to order a fasting insulin test, and the physician wrote back a message, and she shared that with me, and it was like, "I'm not really sure what a fasting insulin test is. I reached out to some colleagues in endocrinology, and they said that they only check insulin for a type 2 diabetic, and you're only pre-diabetic, so we're not going to do that. And you can't really reverse insulin resistance anyways." And I'm like, "You need a new doctor, girl. Like, this is not okay medical advice." So again, I think that sometimes physicians are just kind of caught in that rut of like helping a lot of people every day, and they're just kind of going through the motions. Not every physician, they're well-meaning, but look for stories like these. We have a lot of success stories on our podcast of people that have been reversing insulin resistance, losing weight. So I think the best thing is just, if you can really do this and get a hold of this, like think about the ripple effect that you have. Think about the ray of hope that you would be for your circle of friends and your circle of family. Like right now, you may be in a place where you're seeking that hope and you're seeking that information and you're seeking that inspiration, but over time you will become that for somebody else, which is really cool to think about.
Coming back to that conventional medicine piece, I'd be curious, a medical student right now learning about type 2 diabetes, are they learning it's reversible or not? My guess would be not, but I can't say for sure.
Oh, I can't say for
You
sure
might know
either. And I
better.
really think that different medical programs have different curriculum. I read the book Metabolical by Dr. Robert Lustig, and I think that he's involved in a medical curriculum program. So I'm sure at the school that he's involved with, they're learning that it's reversible. They're learning more about metabolic health and nutrition and lifestyle changes. But my guess is it's a lot of pharmacology. It's a lot of when someone's blood sugar is this level, then it's time to the first line of medication you prescribe is metformin. If they're not tolerating metformin, then we try Januvia or whatever the next line of drugs is. If their blood sugars are consistently higher, then this is when we're going to start the long acting insulin. If they do this, this is when we're going to add a short acting insulin. My guess is it's a lot more of that, because for some people that's really important too. Physicians need to know that. Nobody else, pharmacists can obviously understand that too. But I think that largely in traditional medical schools, they're taught to diagnose and prescribe. And that's why I really like to find physicians that have above and beyond training in integrative medicine or functional medicine, because they will understand on a deeper level the causes of these diseases and natural fixes for these diseases, and not just have the only tool in their toolbox be a medication. Because I think a lot of traditionally trained physicians, that's the only tool in their toolbox. They're giving you the best tool that they have. It's just not the only tool that's out there.
Exactly. And you brought insulin in. Basically, at that point, when somebody's being prescribed that, they're putting gasoline on the fire, because you're just facilitating what's going wrong in the body by adding more of the problem, which is too much insulin, to a system.
It's
And
heartbreaking.
yeah, you knowingly or unknowingly, it's definitely just further facilitating everything we're talking about today.
It's heartbreaking. And honestly, this is like one of the reasons why I left traditional PT and came to start my own practice, and why I do so many podcasts and interviews is because I had a patient who was morbidly obese, bedbound for 10 months, had to sell assets, essentially to qualify for Medicaid to get the care that she needed. And then the order on PT and OT, literally said as a last ray of hope, going to order PT and OT. And this woman had, wounds, just skin issues, vision issues from diabetes. She couldn't get up. She couldn't go to the bathroom. She couldn't do anything anymore. And she wasn't that old. And I thought, God, I wish that there was just but she could use a computer. She could use an iPad. I'm I wish that there was some sort of online education that I could give her to help her with her condition, and that I could show her husband to help her with the condition. So on my YouTube channel, I have an insulin resistance for beginners playlist that was made for them in mind, because physicians don't have the time to tell this. And so she was just taking so much insulin, but then there's just potato chips and they're having spaghetti. And I'm oh my gosh, you guys are just let's pump the body with some glucose, and then let's add more insulin to get rid of that glucose, but that's making the problem of insulin resistance even worse. So I hooked him up with a nutritionist at Hy-Vee, and she essentially just told him to change to whole wheat pasta. And I'm I understand meeting somebody where they're at, but that's not going to cut it. And so I really recognize the limitations, not only of traditional medicine, but also often registered dietitians, even if they have diabetes training, recognize that's heavily influenced by other interests, and they're not always providing the best advice for diabetics, like the diabetes plate method, for example. So that's why I kind of left, and I'm God, someone needs to help these people and I can't do it from this setting. And so I think that I'm hoping that I've been able to help a lot of people at this point understand insulin resistance better, understand that they don't have to succumb to those insulin injections. They don't have to resign to medications, even if diabetes runs in their family, even if you've had it for a while. I can't remember. Last time I was on the podcast, did I tell you the story of the guy with the amputated foot?
You did.
Can I read?
But share it again, because that's a good one.
It's so powerful. I was going in to do an eval for this gentleman. He lived in an apartment. And I saw that he had a history of diabetes, multiple amputations, multiple toes. He had one foot amputated. So I went in and I was going to do his medication reconciliation, where we go over every single medication someone's on. And I was where's your diabetes medications? Because you have amputations, you have a history of diabetes, you're not taking any medications. I was oh my gosh, let me check your blood sugar because it's probably raging high. And he's I don't need them anymore. I got off of them. And I was oh, how'd you do that? And that's impressive. And he's well, I just changed my diet finally. I stopped eating a bunch of garbage and I started eating low carb, and I reversed my diabetes. And I was good for you. What motivated you to do that? And he's I didn't want him to take my other foot because then I couldn't live independently anymore. So his independence, his quality of life was reduced to a stand pivot transfer from his recliner chair to his wheelchair, or his wheelchair to the toilet, or wheelchair to bed. But he was still living independently. And so even at that stage of advanced diabetes, it is still possible through lifestyle changes to get off of your medications and preserve. It's not like you can reverse certain things. A lot of times you can't undo an amputation. You can't undo some of the peripheral neuropathy. You can't undo some of the vision changes. So there does come a point where some of these harms from diabetes can't be reversed, but they can certainly be stopped or slowed. So I think that's the other piece of hope for people is, man, you're never too, quote unquote, far gone. It's never too late. You can always change. And for the love of Pete, if you don't want to do it for yourself, do it for your loved ones, because there are people who care about you. There are people who worry about you, and they want the best for you. So want the best for yourself, I think, is my point there. Because just as a PT, I worked with a lot of older adults, but also their caregivers. And so I know the toll that can take on a caregiver to care for somebody who has diabetes and medication changes, or they have cognitive impairment because of their diabetes, or frequent falls because of their diabetes and they can't feel their feet anymore. So I really have a heart for the caregivers too, in these scenarios. And I think that sometimes podcasts like this and that playlist are just as beneficial for the caregivers, because those are the people that are actually doing the cooking, and facilitating the exercise and the mobility and that kind of stuff.
You mentioned before that your dad is diabetic. Has he been receptive to this message you're sharing?
Oh, he's my toughest client. I think that he it's so interesting, to know what I know now, but not know what it's just like growing up, right? Like we had dessert every night after dinner. He was really sedentary. Um, he brought us a candy bar every day after school because he wanted to stop and get one. We did not understand nutrition in our home growing up. It's no wonder that he got type 2 diabetes. Um, and it got kind of bad there for a while. Um, I definitely have noticed some cognitive changes in him over the years. Absolutely noticed mobility changes. He's had 2 hip replacements. Each hip has been replaced. I think a big part of the joint deterioration was insulin resistance. He struggled with gout, which, as Dr. Rick Johnson in his book we've mentioned a couple of times, goes into fructose and uric acid and gout issues, and how closely linked they are to type 2 diabetes. And sometimes I wonder, like, do you just not care, Dad? Do you just not care enough to change? But if you look back over the course of time, he has changed. He was 235 and he's down to, at one point he was 190. I think he's probably hovering around that. So he's lost over 30 pounds and has kept it off. His A1C has reduced significantly. He has reduced the amount of medications that he's on. He's improved. I would say he's slowed the cognitive decline, but honestly, a lot of it came from educating my mom, because she's the one that does the cooking. But she also has had to develop boundaries around, he's going to make his choices. I can present him with healthy food, and if he wants to keep his Skittles and Starburst hidden away in the house somewhere, that's his prerogative. But I would definitely say that because of me, pounding in his head over and over and over, stop eating sugar, please. It's getting better. And the awareness. And I say this long story to help people understand, okay, well, what's the number one thing that helped him? A continuous glucose monitor. Because I could tell him something till I'm blue in the face, and it either wouldn't register or he wouldn't care. But once he slapped on a continuous glucose monitor, that is really what was the most motivating thing for him to change his diet. That clicked for him. Seeing that instantaneous data clicked more than anything else. So for people who are really resistant, like if you have somebody in your life who's super resistant to changing their diet, I'd highly encourage seeing if they could get a continuous glucose monitor, if they would agree to a trial, because that really did help my dad. And I do think he's a lot more mindful. He's a lot more aware. But I think another thing with him is he's not eating enough, honestly, sometimes, enough protein. So as he ages and he's not physically active enough, he's losing muscle mass. I'm really seeing that a lot. So he's slowing down, he's losing endurance. And so it's not only a blood sugar issue. Remember, it's a muscle mass and a quality of life and a mobility issue. So those would be all the things, if I could change something at this point, I would have him be eating 3 solid big doses of protein a day and regularly exercising. So I think he's done a nice job kind of modifying his diet in general, reducing the sugar, reducing the refined carbs. But I'd like to see him go a little bit further with building and maintaining his muscle mass and mobility.
Part I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more on. Somebody in our realm that understands the physiology and the consequences of living a lifestyle that brings on diabetes and continues to maintain that. How do we support someone in our life if they are resisting and we're trying to help them, We care about them. How do you find that boundary of this is me trying to help you, and then this is where I need to just let go?
Oh gosh. I have made, I don't want to call mistakes, but so much trial and error with my dad. Um, with some client, I feel like clients are more open because it's like they're coming to you for help, right? But like my dad, like he's just my dad. Um, and so I think the first thing is living by example, making choices that are good for you and living the healthiest lifestyle that you can, because you will shine that light. You will be that inspiration. If I was unhealthy and I'm trying to tell him how to be healthy, I lose all credibility and he's not going to listen to anything that I say. So I think first and foremost, doing your best to like lead by example. Um, Secondly, as best you can, as best as they'll allow you, just gently change their environment. So maybe buy sugar-free ice cream instead of the sugar ice cream, which there's pros and cons to that too. But making the small adjustment, like stop buying pop. Like if he's not going to the grocery store, stop buying him the things that are spiking his blood sugar and replace them with something else. And if he or she gets upset about it, just gently explain like, oh, I think that this is going to be better for your blood sugar levels. Are you open to trying that? Or, just gentle baby steps. Um, and then once you kind of have your lifestyle established, invite them into that. Say, honey, do you want to go to the gym with me today? Do you want to go? You could just walk for 10 minutes. Before we moved to the farm, I would go to the gym with my dad a lot. And that was something that we really enjoyed together. And even if he's just like cycling at like 1 mile an hour on the bike, like scrolling through Facebook, because that was his kind of normal. And then he might walk a couple laps and scroll again. And I'm like, hey, he's there, he's moving. And so it was a real progression from like me trying to like be his personal trainer at the gym to me just being like, all right, dad, you're going to do you. I'm glad you're here. Um, so there are some things that we can do, but I think ultimately we do have to develop that detachment. The detachment from the expectation that everybody wants to be super healthy, that everybody has the motivation and the determination to make those changes. And detachment from the sense of control. Because when we become a little bit like more detached from their behavior, we regain some of our personal power. And we're not draining our energy trying to help somebody that doesn't want to be helped. So yeah, those would be some tips for like the really resistant ones, is just lead by example, gentle changes, gentle invitation, and then really practicing that emotional boundary and detaching from, if they say no, don't let that negatively affect you. Just be like, okay, that's their choice to say no to going to the gym. I'm not going to get upset about it.
Coming back to the dietary piece, we've talked about as a whole bringing down carbohydrates. We've mentioned starch, sugar, fructose, which is a type of sugar. How do you look at those three in the carbohydrate realm when somebody's trying to lower their carbs? Is it more of just a general bring your carbs down? Because we've alluded to fructose a couple times, but that's often put in a separate category of being very detrimental to our health. So how do you look at the different pieces under carbohydrates?
Right. So when we're talking about reducing carbohydrates, I think it's essential to primarily reduce the fructose, especially from added sugar. The reason is just because glucose, that is a simple sugar that can be metabolized anywhere in your body. Any cell in your body can use glucose for energy and it can metabolize glucose. But fructose is not the same. So fructose is primarily metabolized in the liver. And large doses of fructose will be converted into liver fat. It essentially overwhelms the liver and it's converted to fat. So, or large amounts of alcohol, right? And then fiber, like we don't really need to focus on reducing fiber in the diet and low carb because fiber doesn't really count towards that net carbs anyways. Net carbs is essentially the total carbs. So starches, sugars, fiber minus the fiber. So when we're thinking about reducing carbohydrates, focus on the high fructose things first. So the added sugar, because like table sugar is half glucose, half fructose, versus like a potato or rice or bread, which is mostly glucose. There's very little fructose in that. Additionally, you're going to want to reduce your fruit intake from the sugary fruits, the bananas, the grapes, the apples, the peaches, the pineapple. Those are pretty high in sugar, high in fructose. And so bias your fruit intake towards blackberries, raspberries, and strawberries. Even blueberries have quite a bit of sugar in them compared to the blackberries and the raspberries and the strawberries. And then, so I would start there. I would start reduce added sugars, reduce high fructose corn syrup, reduce the energy drinks, the foo-foo coffee drinks, the pop. We can talk about artificial sweeteners next. And then I would say focus on reducing the processed carbohydrates, which would be things like chips, pretzels, things that don't come from nature, right? Because those are going to be naturally stripped of the micronutrients and the fiber and all that stuff. And then lastly, so we've kind of gotten rid of the processed carbs, we've gotten rid of the processed sugar, we've gotten rid of the high sugar fruits. Then you're going to focus on reducing the starchy vegetables, like rice isn't a vegetable, but like the potatoes, the corn, that kind of stuff. Focus on non-starchy vegetables that have more fiber, less starch. And then also just reducing the grains. So beans and legumes, I feel like are a pretty safe starch because they come with so much fiber and they come with so much protein. You just want to watch the portions. But that's kind of like the hierarchy that I would start to reduce carbohydrates when you are reducing them. So hopefully that was clear enough.
No, that's great. And now let's move into artificial sweeteners and then pivoting into some of them that are kind of in that realm, but are accepted in the natural health world, like monk fruit and stevia.
Yeah, so I mean, people pronounce it different. I say stevia, which is totally fine. So stevia and monk fruit are the two that I stick with the most, and allulose for baking. Allulose has a little bit more bulk and it caramelizes and browns better than monk fruit or stevia. So that's a nice one for baking. I really like the sweet leaf stevia liquid drops for like if I make hot chocolate or something like that, I'll just put some milk and cocoa powder and a few stevia drops, maybe some cinnamon in there. That works so well. And you save so much sugar from just the stevia drops. Personally, I don't really like erythritol for a couple of reasons. The metallic taste that it has on the tongue. I don't really like that like burning aftertaste, but number two, it like destroys my gut. Like I just like get so gassy when I have erythritol. So I really try to avoid it. It doesn't really stimulate glucose or insulin. There was one study that showed it might increase clotting, but I feel like other really great people have kind of poo-pooed that. So I don't worry so much about that side of erythritol as like the GI upset that I get when I eat erythritol. And then some other ones that I would actually avoid would be sucralose, acesulfame potassium, aspartame, and saccharin. Maltodextrin is another one we could add in there. That's more of a food thickener, which is in like sugar-free Jell-O. So I always say like, okay, get some sugar-free Jell-O. Look what your CGM is. Eat the Jell-O. There's no sugar, but it's still going to spike your blood sugar because the maltodextrin will spike blood sugar even though it's not sugar. But some of those are going to harm your gut health. So I think when we're talking about blood sugar regulation and insulin resistance, having a good, strong gut is very important because you're going to have lower systemic inflammation. You're going to be able to better digest and absorb the nutrients that you do eat. So reducing those artificial sweeteners in your diet, like cutting out the diet pop. Like if you're a really big pop drinker and you're like, I can't give this up, fine. Go to Zevias. Like Zevias have no artificial colors. They're sweetened with stevia. Poppies are another option, as are Olipops. So both Poppy and Olipop have some probiotics added to them for gut health, some fiber. Some of the, I think Poppy especially has apple cider vinegar added. So, and there's only like a teaspoon of sugar compared to, it's like 5 grams compared to 40 grams, which is like what's in a normal Pepsi. So significantly lower sugar. There are always good, better, best options, but I really suggest people stop drinking pop and diet pop altogether. That goes into the mindset side of things. Some other gut health tips, aside from like stopping the artificial sweeteners, like the ones that I mentioned, really including some prebiotic fiber in your diet. So like green bananas, asparagus, artichoke. You can just Google like foods high in prebiotic fiber. Many fruits and vegetables, just keep them low starch, low sugar. That's going to feed the good bacteria in your gut and help them grow and keep them happy. And then probiotics, like we were talking about, I think Dr. William Davis's book Super Gut is really good on this. He has a SIBO, like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth recipe. So a SIBO yogurt recipe that I really like. That's kind of my number one choice to get that. You have like added strains of probiotics that you mix in with some inulin, some fiber powder, like a prebiotic powder. And then I use half and half in it. And then it's a 36-hour fermentation process in a yogurt machine. It's really good. It's easy. But other like fermented foods like kimchi, sauerkraut, kombucha, if there's no sugar in it, those kinds of things. Yogurt, if it has like live probiotics, live microorganisms to help reinoculate your gut, that's important too. So we want to think about what are we adding in to help reinoculate and feed the good bacteria? And then what are we keeping out to prevent that bacterial disruption? So like the artificial sweeteners, but another one that people don't know about a lot is food emulsifiers. So things like carrageenan and lecithin. So lecithin is a byproduct of like oil, like making refined oil. So if you look at the back of a low carb bar, for example, very common on protein bars, you'll see soy lecithin or soy, like different kinds like sunflower oil lecithin. That's a food emulsifier, and those can contribute to leaky gut, which essentially contributes to inflammation. So carrageenan is in like the sugar-free Ready Whip, for example. It's just like make your own whipped cream, get some stevia drops, get some vanilla. No carrageenan needed. So those are some just gut health tips, kind of piggybacking on the artificial sweetener combination that people can do to kind of tighten up those junctions in their gut. So preventing the leaky gut, preventing things that are supposed to be in the gut from leaking into the bloodstream and causing inflammation. And then also just things to help it grow. It's almost like a garden. You want to help that gut microbiome thrive with giving it the right probiotics and prebiotics.
And when it comes to specific strains, anything you can recommend in that realm, whether it be through a yogurt or supplement? I believe it's Akkermansia that's supposed to be good for metabolic health, but you might know
I
better.
honestly would not know them off the top of my head, but I would go to the Super Gut book because he talks about a lot of the strains in there. And it took me a while to find them. Like when I was making the SIBO recipe, and this was like all new to me. So I'm like, oh, okay. So the strain of probiotic does matter. So I'd recommend that book as a resource, but off the top of my head, I could not throw out like the 5 or 6 syllable strain, but that's where I would start, is looking into that. And then being sure you get the right strain, right? Because they are different. They do matter.
All right, Morgan, last time we talked, we went deeper into mindset, but I know it's a big piece of the puzzle for you and the people you're working with. We've talked about hope, which ties into that, and I think it's a big part of what we're helping facilitate through this conversation. But for somebody right now who is on the fence with all this, they feel exhausted, they've tried so many things, leave them with something in the mindset realm to help facilitate them getting started with all this.
You know, honestly, one thing that I find helpful is just reminding them that they're already living their worst case scenario. Trying to get better is probably going to make things a little bit better, or it's going to give you the experience that you need to make a better choice next time. So whenever I was like starting this business, for example, that took a lot of courage. That took a lot of hope. That took a lot of faith. And the one thing that really made me be like, okay, let's do it, was reminding myself I'm already living my worst case scenario. I already have a good job. I already have a nice husband. Like, what is there to lose? So if you're sitting there thinking like, God, I just don't have it in me to make another lifestyle change, Well, you're already living your worst case scenario. And then I think the other thing is using a little bit of fear to motivate can be okay. And you've probably heard the saying, like, if nothing changes, nothing changes. And that's not true when it comes to insulin resistance, because as we've been talking this whole time, if nothing changes, things get worse. So I think that reminding yourself of those two things, and then also reminding yourself, really, really reframing failure. There is no such thing as failure after you go. So like once you start, once you make a change, there is no failure. You either get the result that you wanted or the lesson that you needed. And both of those are so beneficial. So if people are really stuck in kind of that negative mindset, I would encourage them to use a little bit of fear as their friend, and then reframe. There's no failure. You get the lesson that you needed or the result that you wanted, and both are a gain. Have you read the book The Gap and the Gain, by the way?
No, I haven't heard
It's
of it.
good. You haven't heard about it even?
No, is it new?
Okay. It's kind of new. Yeah, it's a very simple concept. And so for people who struggle with this more of a negative mindset or like an achiever mindset, and if you're not reaching your goal, you're not being successful, and then it's almost too hard to try again. It's really simple. It's like you're either focusing on your gaps or you're focusing on your gains. And so what we want to do is we want to focus on our gains, because that's going to be motivating. That's going to it's almost like a cleaner fuel for your mind. Instead of motivating yourself from your gap of like, oh gosh, I have 20 pounds more to lose. Or my blood sugar is still in this range. Saying like, well, I've already lost 20 pounds. My blood sugar is already improved by X amount. So that's a really like clean example of like focusing on the gain versus focusing on the gap. So instead of saying, oh, my workout today was not as good as I wanted it to be. That's in the gap mindset. You could say, yeah, my workout wasn't as good as I wanted it to be, but I showed up for myself. I made a commitment and I stuck to that commitment. I was there for 20 minutes and I did this and this and this. Can you see that energetic shift? So simple, but I would recommend reading the book too, because they go into deeper insights, and I really enjoyed it. It's very short. So I think that's my last kind of mindset tip. We could talk about this forever, mindset forever, but shifting yourself into your gains, actively keeping a list of what you've accomplished each day, what you're proud about each day, and not like all the things that you still have left to do and all the things that you haven't done yet. So that's been really helpful for me and a lot of our members.
I like all that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll add one piece where we've just chatted for about 2 hours. And for people, especially if this is all new to them and they're feeling like they're in a really bad position right now with their health, it can be really overwhelming. A lot of detail here, a lot of nuance.
Oh, yeah.
But for a lot of people, they can start small. Pick a few things from what we talked about, build that momentum. I also want to caveat that people that may be in a position where they have cancer or, they're on the verge of having amputations of limbs. Everybody has their own story and timeline they need to work with. But if you are somebody right now who is feeling overweight, maybe your energy is depleted, you're inflamed, don't overwhelm yourself. Get some small wins here. Pick some of the big pillars. Give yourself time. Give yourself patience. Allow yourself, like you said, to make mistakes. And come back to this conversation. Take something from it today. Come back to it. And we're rooting for you.
That's a really great piece of advice, because if you've listened to this and now you're thinking, oh my gosh, I have like 20 things to improve in my health, you're automatically in the gap. So I want you to think, okay, again, I listened to this interview. Another gain, I'm going to go buy blue light blocking glasses. Another gain, I'm going to have like one more glass of water today than I did yesterday. So getting on that micro level and focusing on what you are doing instead of all the things that you aren't doing, that's going to build that positive momentum. So I completely agree.
All right, Morgan, I appreciate round 2. We're going to link up your website, your social media, everything in the show notes. And I wish you all the best with your pregnancy, your birth, and all this beautiful time with your family.
Thank you, Jesse. I appreciate it.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
One of the most important things that C15 does is it serves as an armor that helps to stabilize our cell membranes. Really important because it prevents them from breaking down, which is a primary cause of aging.